So without further ado, Janice, you're interested in, I guess I'll go first. I am Assistant Director of the Italian Language Program and Assistant Professor of Teaching here at Ohio State University in Columbus. I am focused on world language pedagogy and critical intercultural learning. I am also interested in inclusive teaching, and I have an endorsement for that here at OSU. And I'm currently engaged in a COIL, a collaborative online international learning exchange with students in Siena. It's a great experience. So be happy to talk about that more, maybe much later on. Janice, do you want to introduce yourself and explain your situation?
My situation, yes, my situation. So hi, everybody, Janice Askey at OSU. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. I'm so pleased that we were invited. I'm honored to be here. I think you can read what I'm about, but what I wanted to really draw your attention to is a webinar series that April and I put together with our colleagues at Purdue, where you can see the link at the bottom of my introduction there, where we have put we've collaborated to put together a lot of resources and background on incorporating intercultural competence into the language classroom. So if you have a chance, go have a look at those webinars. They were fun to do and great to work with our Purdue colleagues, and I hope you enjoy it. My situation. Oh yeah. My situation is that I'm actually going to be leaving in about 20 minutes to go to New York, ironically. So we had a bit of a snafu logistically, and April is going to take over the webinar, but you are in the best hands possible. I can say that I can't live without April. So there we go. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Janice. We are going to just give you a brief overview of what we're doing. We have some slides today on what intercultural competence is, why it's important, how we are putting it into the classroom. And we want to draw a distinction. We want to make clear a distinction between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence that we're working with in our program. Then we have some slides about types of activities and really wanting to think today about how to target different attitudes, qualities, and skills with those activities. I see Tatiana here, and I'm going to have a shout out to the Hubicle as well in these slides, how we can target different attitudes, qualities, and skills of intercultural competence. And then finally, our example activities. We want to be able to do one of these with you in real time. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the next slide. Janice will tell you what to do, but please make sure that you're writing only to me in the chat.
Hey everybody, so this is one of our fun activities. We're simply going to ask you very briefly to describe the scene in the chat right to April. Please identify the location, who the people are, and what they're doing. Be as specific as you can without being overly long. And we'll give you like a minute or two to go ahead and just pop them into the chat to April.
Thank you for the ones coming in.
Just throw anything out there, and there's no right answer here. Whatever comes to mind.
And we'll say sometimes we use different images for this type of activity, and we'll get into that maybe a little bit later, but you'll see that we have a book down here. We have a reference down here at the bottom, Exploring Culture, Exercises, Stories, and Synthetic Cultures, that you can reference if you are interested in this photo or in
other ones. Yeah, they have other
other ones, right? There are many in there that can help you facilitate activities of this type.
So April, when you've got a mass that's enough to work with, just let me know and we can move forward.
Yeah. Let's
Critical
see.
mass, that's the word I was looking for.
All right. Yeah, it looks like we're getting close. Feel free to go ahead and send them in. Just keep, it looks like they're all coming in right now. So they won't go anywhere in my chat, but we will proceed.
Okay, so I think I'm going to start us off by talking about definitions, because
Sorry.
there can be a lot of confusion out there about the definition of intercultural competence. And so this definition by Deerdorf, 2006, also 2011, one that we've used for our research. And we're not going to talk about our research in this webinar today, but we have some wonderful results on our longitudinal study on the development of intercultural competence in students from 101 through 103. That's been positive. But this is the definition we're working off of. Okay, so the key points to understand here is about it being a lifelong process. And we're talking about the development of attitudes, knowledge, skills, and qualities in order to communicate effectively to achieve one's goals to some degree. So as you can see, this isn't specifically directed at speaking a world language. I'll let them in. Next slide, please.
Yeah. Go ahead. We
Did
would
you
like
want to go?
I'll go ahead. Today we want to draw to your attention two other definitions and there are a lot of definitions of intercultural competence out there, and but there are ones that suit us best according to our purposes, right? What we are trying to do. That one for us is Deerdorf, and that'll become clear a little bit later. But another one you probably want to keep in mind is the one that the AAC&U value rubric is using, which comes from Bennett. And intercultural knowledge and competence is a set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills and characteristics that support effective and appropriate interaction in a variety of cultural contexts. This is important because it's what the value rubric is based off of. And if you're looking at the value rubric in order to design your activities and to assess whether your activities are allowing your students to develop intercultural competence, or intercultural communicative competence, you want to keep this handy, but it's certainly a little less specific than the Deerdorf definition that we use. The second one is a recent rehash from Tara Harvey. She is, maybe you know her, she's an important intercultural educator and coach in the field. And she had this to say, even just last week, that intercultural competence is succinctly the ability to communicate and act appropriately, effectively, and authentically across cultural difference. And she adds that it's not just relevant when engaging with people from other nationalities and ethnicities. Practicing intercultural competence can be useful anytime we are engaging across difference. And this brings up another important point, that intercultural competence isn't something we have or we don't, it's something that we practice. I think this is really compelling language, everyday language, but it's really compelling language that allows us to think about why intercultural competence needs to be incorporated into our classrooms. I think all three of these things you have heard in the past, so we'll say them really quickly, that intercultural competence development and training responds to the impact of globalization in our world and in our classrooms. It responds to the call for training in diversity and inclusion. We can talk about this later as well, but intercultural competence training is being used in lots of different diversity and inclusion spaces. And that's mainly in English, with slightly different activities than the ones that we design for a language classroom. But nonetheless, it is part and parcel of the journey towards more diversity and inclusion in our classrooms and in our programs. And finally, maybe you're familiar with this as well, that intercultural competence is in the top 5 of the top 10 skills needed to work in the future, right? It's at number 4. That was last year. After all is said and done over the next couple years, it'll probably be number 2. But moving on, this is our why. We want to say how. And we have degrees of intercultural competence are achieved in the language classroom. And for us, it is dependent upon 2 things. This is something you might have heard me say in the past, but it is dependent upon the course being taught in the target language. And it is dependent upon intercultural competence being explicitly taught in activities. Meaning you need to have activities that target intercultural competence development. It's not enough to teach the way that we have been teaching. It's not enough to use old activities. We need to revisit those and make sure intercultural competence is part of our goal. And we need to continue teaching in the language, in the target language. Let's go forward one more time. Oh, right before Janice leaves, we're going to have her talk about a difference in terms, because this is important also for the title of the, for us, for the title of the symposium, which is Intercultural Communicative Citizenship. And we have a difference between these terms.
Yeah. So, April, do you have the actual definitions on the next slide or not?
Yep, right here.
Yeah. Okay, so they're basically 2 concepts, right? So there's intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence. And as I was moving forward with my research, I realized that this distinction is really important for language teachers. And the reason it came to me first was because every time I kept looking for work that's been done on intercultural competence in the language classroom, it was always at the upper levels, right? Because they were doing everything in the target language. And when you're talking about attitudes and you're talking about behaviors and these are things that you're not going to get from, chapter 2 in 101 when kids are just learning to talk, right? So it's not, we do achieve a certain amount of intercultural communicative competence, meaning, right, that students are able to negotiate a mode of communication and interaction in another language, right? And they're able to get intercultural competence through the communication in another language, right? But, that's not going to happen in the elementary language sequence. And we feel very strongly that this training has to start at the elementary level. And so when we talk about intercultural competence, it's referring back to what Tara Harvey was saying about, it's a practice. And it's not necessarily about speaking in the target language. So my favorite analogy is when I go home and I have to deal with family members, oh my God, I'm using my intercultural competence because I am trying to bridge differences all the time, right? Because, we come from very different backgrounds and cultures in my own family. So I wanted to make that really clear that although we are working on aspects of intercultural communicative competence because we're doing full immersion teaching, the intercultural competence is coming from the activities that we do start in the target language, but we can't complete in the target language in order to reach the depth of understanding that we want to reach.
Got it. Yeah. So let's go forward a second and let's talk about those. What Janice has just ended on is where we're going to keep thinking about the benefits of full or nearly full 90% full immersion teaching and conversations with native speakers can start at the elementary level. For us, it's huge. It's crucial that it starts in the elementary level. And this element of our teaching, this aspect of our teaching uniquely contributes to intercultural competence, right? It's not intercultural communicative competence yet, but we are contributing uniquely to intercultural competence because of these 3 psychological skills that Michael Byram has been highlighting for a decade now. The first is that these students can tolerate ambiguity in communication, and they can tolerate the anxiety that it generates. The second is that they are mindful and cognitively aware of the process of communication rather than the outcome of the communication, and that they begin to adapt to the behavior and expectations of others. This should be one of your prime motivators for why you are engaging in full immersion teaching in Italian in the target language, and you are pursuing intercultural competence, even if the product on your student side is not yet intercultural communicative competence. We are making progress in unique ways in language courses.
Can I just highlight
Yeah.
something there? The reason she keeps saying unique is because I know that issues that I've had at OSU recently, trying to save the world language requirement as we redid the general education program, and trying to incorporate us in a way that administrators, parents, and students can understand, right, is highlighting the uniqueness of what students learn, the skills that they achieve by taking a world language, something they can't get in courses taught in English. And this question was posed to me: what does world language teaching look like in the 21st century? Well, here it is, right? These are the things that we contribute to the skills of our students who are going to move out into the world that they cannot get in any course taught in English.
All right. You can go hop that plane now.
I think I will. So I just wanted to say once again, thank you very much, and have a great continuation of the webinar. And thank you.
All right. Ciao, ciao. Okay, everyone. We still have about 30, 35 minutes together. I have our next point that we've gone over before, and because I know I've talked to some of you before, you've heard me say these things as well. We want to make sure we know what intercultural competence teaching is not, right? It is not only teaching language, right? It is a cliche that language is culture and culture is language. Sometimes this is true, right? Some features of language communicate culture, and some culture is outside of the scope of language, right? This is just too easy. We are not only teaching language in our classrooms. The second thing is that teaching intercultural competence is not teaching cultural knowledge. It's not about products. It is about products and practices when you're thinking about knowledge transfer. But when you're thinking about intercultural competence, we move beyond products and practices. And the last thing that I'll say, and this is something, let me let this person in, is something relatively new that we're thinking of, that we have been thinking about, but that we've recently added to our research, is that this is also not about teaching cultural relativism. This is coming from our students that are some anthropology majors, some of them other social sciences majors, sociology majors. And when we start talking about intercultural competence, they often bring up cultural relativism. And you can imagine why this happens, right? And lots of people can, but the issue is that a relativist perspective, right, says that no judgment can be made from the outside of a cultural context. And as a result, we end up not being able to make any informed critiques. And we end up at a really superficial level of how we are going to actually engage in communication, right? If all we can do is stand back and remove ourselves, remove our judgment, remove this, we're not actually helping our students think about how to engage in communicative acts appropriately and authentically. We don't need them to lose who they are while they manage cultural differences in conversations. They need to be able to keep that, and they need practice doing these things together. So it's not intercultural competence. Teaching and learning is not about cultural relativism, right? It's more complex than that, and it's about guiding students as they engage in their own intercultural learning journey. discovering their own values, discovering their own cultural lenses, and facilitating discussion around the extent to which their values align with the norms and expectations of their own communities and other communities, right? Intercultural competence teaching is all of these things. When we don't have this in mind, we end up in a situation like Maloney, Harborn, and Fielding have described 5 years ago, that teachers frequently believe that they are doing intercultural if they are teaching static culture, thus essentializing both culture as an entity and essentializing the activity of intercultural pedagogy. This requires just a lot of thought from all of us, right? A lot of mindfulness from what we're doing. But I'll go ahead and flip forward and we'll have an opportunity now to think about these things. So what we want to do to make sure that we are doing intercultural competence teaching and learning instead of not, but that we are, is we need to consider our goals and choose our activities appropriately. And I have here 3 strategies to help us align our goals and our activities. We'll talk about them a little bit more. But the first is to use a backward design model. This is what Janice and I do when we create our activities. We outline a specific outcome that we would like, an intercultural competence outcome. And then we think back to what is the obstacle that our students are facing cognitively or affectively that is not allowing them to reach that intercultural development. And then as we think about outcome back to obstacle, we can better create an activity that can help them make progress. And I have a couple of examples of this coming up. But our second strategy is to learn more about developmental models of intercultural competence and to tailor our activities to our students. This is because we all need, it is one thing, right? It's something to say that we know the definition of intercultural competence, and it's one thing to say that we know what intercultural competence teaching is not. It's another to understand intercultural competence teaching and learning as a developmental strategy, as a pedagogical strategy. And this means that you meet your students where they are, and you try to move them up a little bit further. In the same way that you would never enter an elementary classroom speaking as if people were at the intermediate level, B1 or B2 speakers. You would never talk to an A1 class as if they were B2 speakers. You can't talk to students who you think are in denial or in polarization, right? These are lower levels in terms of intercultural competence development, as if they were over here in acceptance or in adaptation. You have to you have to realize where they are and then tailor your activities to suit where they are. And this involves just learning more about the developmental models, right, of intercultural competence. This is again work by Bennett and some others, but there's lots of information out there about how we understand people's progress in intercultural competence. And the third thing over here is to use the cubicle at Purdue, right, to filter activities for these things. So let me move forward and go back to the definition a second and say that when we target a specific attitude, skill, or quality, the reason we're using this definition is because when I said to target an outcome, to think of an outcome, we think of it like this. We think, okay, so my outcome is openness and curiosity. This is what I want students to practice through my activity. I want them to practice openness and curiosity. Well, what's their barrier? What's their obstacle to openness and curiosity? It's stereotypes and it's assumptions, right? The assumptions that they make about Italian culture and the stereotypes they have of Italian culture and Italian peoples is what stops them from being able to be open and curious. So if I want them to be open and curious, I'm going to have to challenge their stereotypes and challenge their assumptions. So this is just an example with attitudes. You could also take knowledge. You could also take skills or qualities. Although I will say that we do not, in our activities, we have not yet targeted skills. We use full immersion teaching to target skills, right? When we think of listening and observing and these sorts of things, but we definitely work on qualities. So this is the first example that I've just given, is that if I want to target curiosity and openness, I will likely want to challenge students' assumptions and stereotypes. If I want to, a second one is, if I want to target cultural decentering, I will create an activity that pushes students to recognize the equal validity of different perspectives. Right? If they are unable to decenter culturally, it means they're unable to give equal value and equal credit to diverse perspectives. So I'm going to go back just one slide and show this again. And I'm actually going to give you a few seconds to think, to choose one of these, to choose respect, to choose valuing, openness, curiosity, a type of knowledge, or a quality, and think about what your students are facing as an obstacle. What is standing in their way of developing this skill, attitude, or quality? Because that's what's going to drive the type of activity you're going to make. And see, we're okay on time. And I'm going to have a little bit of water. If anybody would like to send that to me in the chat privately or publicly, I'd love to know what you're thinking about with your own students. Which of these attitudes, types of knowledge, or qualities you'd like to address with your activities? And what do you think is your students' barrier to having more of that attitude or quality? And I'm still going to wait another 2 minutes or so before moving on. Knowledge of self, right? That is a very good place to be. Well, Tatiana, I see your question. And yes, I will answer that in a bit. I see a couple, a few activities, or a few, right, targets coming in about knowledge of self, self-awareness, absolutely. But what maybe, what is the, so what do we think is the obstacle to student self-awareness? Is it the time that do they not have time, or are they lacking, right? What might be the obstacle to having more self-awareness? Upbringing, thank you, Angela. Grazie, Angela. Upbringing, personality. Interesting. I like not seeing themselves in the curriculum. Let's let someone else in. Okay. Unlearning, unlearning the goals. Sure. And their grades and stereotypes, misinformation. We have 3 different activity types to share with you today, but I will say that, you know, Janice and I, in the 2.5 years that we've been working on this now, have always found that the more we isolate the attitude and the quality or the type of knowledge that our students are lacking and what they want, how we want them to grow, and then we think what it is that they're missing, what's their obstacle and what's their barrier, we've made better activities, right? We've had more success with their activities as we've thought more about their obstacles and about a backwards design of where we want them to end up being. I'll move forward one more time and say, if for some reason you would be struggling, which there are many reasons for that, especially with how busy we all are at thinking, right? And thinking in these terms, these are 2 screenshots from the Cubicle at Purdue, and it allows you to filter activities for the AAC&U rubric, right? And these are, we looked at their definition before. You can filter for what you're trying to target. And if you know where your students are, or you can pretty well guess where your students are on the intercultural development continuum, you can also filter for denial, polarization, minimization, and acceptance. And you can find some activities, and maybe these activities won't be perfectly suited to the language classroom. Maybe you'll have to make some adaptations to them, but these are good starting points when you're not going, if you're not sure, or you're running short on time, or you just want a lot of different ideas, you can use the Cubicle filters to help you target these different skills and attitudes and qualities. So if we move forward, the 3 types of activities that I'm going to be talking to you about in the next 30 minutes or so is, our first type is an introduction to intercultural competence in the language classroom. And we have it here as an introduction. It's a series of a video series with Jhumpa Lahiri that explores attitudes, expectations, and challenges. We call it an introduction because we do it at the very beginning of elementary language learning. But I'd also like to say to you, please make note and think about using them multiple times and in multiple different semesters. And I'll say more about that in a minute. The second type of template for an activity is an image exploration activity. And it is about awareness and cognitive dissonance. And we call these cosa vedi, cosa capisci. In some intercultural competence circles, they are to describe, oh, Tatiana, you could help me, but the acronym.
It's called DIE.
DIE.
Description,
right.
interpretation, and evaluation.
Evaluation, right? Description, interpretation, evaluation. We are trying to do, when we do them in the language, I think we do a little bit more of that evaluation at home. I can show you this as well coming up, but this is our second type of activity. And then our third type of activity is based upon partner conversations with native speakers. And there are different ones possible under these circumstances. And I also, because we really like to focus on this a lot, there are full immersion classroom skills and qualities that our students are gaining every day that we teach in the language, like their tolerance of ambiguity and their resiliency and their attention to conversation and their ability to adapt to the expectations of others and adapt their behavior. These they're learning all the time. So please make sure that you are thinking about full immersion classroom skills and qualities as something that you are doing daily in your classrooms. And then these other three are templates, right, for activities. So let's look. I think most of us are familiar with Jhumpa Lahiri. This set of videos is something that we would like to introduce you to. If you have not seen them, it's material available on the internet through McGraw-Hill. Janice went and filmed with Jhumpa Lahiri, I think a day or two before COVID, before the lockdown in early 2020. And from their interview, they were able to create mini videos, right? None of them are longer than 2 minutes, that focus on a different aspect of language learning and intercultural competence. Jhumpa Lahiri is a Pulitzer Prize winning author of Bengali parents, and she grew up bilingual, but she didn't decide that she wanted to do Italian or learn Italian until she was an adult, right? And she brings wonderful perspective. And these are awesome videos to help guide students to a lot of self-reflection about what they're doing in the language classroom, to ramp up motivation along the way. One that we particularly show, right, and give you an activity for, or some reflection questions for, is this video from Jhumpa, learning a new language. In this video, she does not only talk about language learning, but she really talks about mindset, and she talks about letting go. And you'll see I have some sample reflection questions here, right? So for every single one of these videos, we have 2 to 3 reflection questions. And our students complete these reflections at the beginning of the semester, in the beginning of their first course. But they are awesome videos to bring up regularly, right? We have 3 levels of elementary courses. And so also in our 2nd level elementary course and in our 3rd level elementary course, we regularly bring up the themes and the messages that Jhumpa has in these videos. But in this first one, learning a new language, right? You can think about doing this as a group or an individual private reflection, because she really goes beyond, right, the tricks to memorize a new language, but she talks about disarming oneself. And she talks about, this common feeling of not feeling as confident, proud, or secure. And in number 2 here, I'll draw your attention to a lot of people were thinking about self-reflection and self-awareness as something that their students could really work on more, that they would like to see in them. I think asking them if they can see a positive side to not feeling as confident, to not feeling as proud or secure, can really allow them to unlock this other side of themselves where they are taking risks, right? And they get to know themselves better as individuals who can be risk takers, who can learn a new language. And then in this learning a new language small clip, Jhumpa Lahiri also mentions why it's fundamental to engage with something that is outside of us, whether that's beyond our comfort zone or beyond the environment that we live in. So this is just a really great video, but again, there are many to choose from, and they are available to you publicly at that website. You'll get this PowerPoint, so I'm not going to go backwards, but we really want to introduce, and we want it to be clear to students. We want to explicitly talk about the language learning process and intercultural competence development, like skills and attitudes and qualities in this way. Another type of activity, right, the one that I just mentioned and that Tatiana helped me with on the description, is something on the acronym, is our awareness and dissonance activities. And these come in 3 phases, right? The first thing that we want to do when we're making one of these activities is to trigger awareness and or cognitive dissonance, right? So this is based on Meziro's theory of transformative learning. We want to get learners to challenge their frames of reference, especially the ones that they take for granted, or the ones that they have adopted unconsciously or uncritically. Someone mentioned in the chat about upbringing, right? Many of our frames of reference are given to us by our upbringing, and those are things that we adopt, right? Unconsciously or uncritically. So by presenting students with an image that they can explore and that can challenge, right, them to be more aware, and that can create some dissonance, we can really get them into a spot to challenge their essentialized notions of culture, right? They're in a good place to move forward in this. And once an issue or has come to a learner's attention and has provoked interest or concern, or they're perplexed, the next step is analysis and interpretation. And the thing we want to do in analysis and interpretation is make sure that, sure, we're talking about what is this, who is this, but we want to move past the surface, and we want to think about process, and we want to think about, again, interpretation, as it suggests, why and how, right? And we want to get to a why and how. This can be with the whole class. It can be an individual writing. It could be in small groups. It really depends on your instructional context, the way in which you'd like to do an activity like this. But we really want to make sure that we are moving beyond superficial descriptions of what and where and down to why and how, so that multiple interpretations and a level of complexity come out. And once we're finished with these, we work on personal reflection, and we have personal reflection questions that our students complete at home. And it's very important that students be given the opportunity to think independently and privately, and with as much time as they need right outside of the classroom. So before we give examples, I want to point out that, you know, it's common, the two examples that we have used that we are showing you here today are examples that Janice and I have used with high school students in outreach here in Columbus. And sometimes they seem banal or you know, too easy, but we would really encourage you to start that way and get to know your student, the types of things that your students, the way your students will respond to you. There's nothing wrong, and we're often really surprised actually by where our students are in terms of their understanding of diversity and their experiences, right? Their global experiences, that, you know, there is no harm in starting with something that may seem simple to you and building on that and doing more of these often. And you get more complex as you go. And it's what getting to know your students in that way is what allows you to really grow with them. Maybe this is something we can talk about, Tatiana, but like as a stage-based, right? Stage-based learning is that if you set a benchmark somewhere, and then you can get more complex as you get to know the group of students. So this is number one. A che cosa pensi quando pensi all'Italia? This is something that we can regularly do in Italian, right? In our group, just so that we can get a little. I don't want to talk at you for the next 20 minutes. Could you write what you think your students would say if you presented them with this question? So don't answer as yourself, answer as your students, and maybe to everybody this time. This certainly doesn't need to be private. Pizza, cibo, cultura. Yeah. Sì, la pizza. This will play nicely. I gesti pure, automobili, Super Mario Brothers. Bene. Allora, we'll we can elicit this brainstorming activity from our students, and then I'm going to show you a few pictures, but I want to first tell you, right, that this is an activity, right? This is an activity that we have designed to target students' openness and curiosity beyond their assumptions, right? So we've put together this series of photos because we'd like to challenge the ways that they stereotypically, right, and or just regularly, right, think of Italy. So this is just an example. I've cut it down for today. You may think of a longer version, but we have these images. And this is something we were doing, right, earlier in the pandemic as well, as you can tell. And I'll stick with this one before we go back. So you can imagine that we've asked our students what they think of most readily, right? What do they think of when they think of Italy? And all of these things that you've mentioned in the chat come to mind. And then we showed them pictures that, images that don't really line up, right, with that. I'd like you to think for a second, or, I'd ask you to think for a second, which images would make sense to you for your students in your classroom to show that would give them this alternate, right, an alternate vision or multiple alternate visions of Italy beyond the ones, right, that they readily keep in their minds. And at this point, right, we would ask them, and we do ask them, right, we ask them to reflect, why did we show you these pictures, right? Why did we show you these images? And a lot of them come up, right? I'm not sure exactly what your students would say, but a lot of the students that we encounter do have a really good vocabulary these days. And so they'll say, oh, well, because you want us to see Italy beyond like the big city. You want us to see what Italy is like, what it's like when you're not in a big city, and beyond the stereotypes. And it's like, yes, this is exactly where we want to get started, right? We want, every time you think of Italy, I'd like you to think of a complex picture. I'd like you to think of a whole country, right? Or of multiple populations. And so this is an example of the personal reflection that our students would do at home. And just one second, how did you feel when you saw the images of Italy? Or which images of Italy do you carry with you most often in your mind? How do you think you might react when your mental images of Italy do not match the reality that you are seeing? So, putting themselves like they are in country, and they're having, right, a dissonant moment there. How do you think you might react, right? And finally, another what if you were trying to explain to an Italian the diversity of situations and circumstances in your country? Which images might you show? So if we look at this reflection, I don't have an extra slide about this, but I think it's worth noting that when we ask our students to reflect, we are asking, we want to ask first how they felt, right? We want to ask how they felt, and we want to ask what they learned. Some of this comes from what's known as the Tiaghi method, but how they felt, what they learned, and then we want to move this into their real life, right? Into their everyday life, and we want to give them hypotheticals, right, for moving forward. So this, how do you think you will or you might react when you are in this situation? We want them to posit themselves being in the situation and how they will act, right? How their behavior will adapt. And we also want to give them a what if where they are the person in charge, so to speak. We like to give them a what if where they have agency. So what if you were trying to explain, right, your situation and the diversity and the circumstances in your country? Which images would you show? So this is the outline for the personal reflection. I'm going to skip through one on food. We already came up with a lot of, and maybe you've seen this before, and I encourage you, I think maybe we've even done this in one of the webinars. So I'd encourage you to go and look for it, but I'm going to go forward. I will show you the reflection for the food pictures. You can imagine whichever type of pictures of Italian foods or foods that you can find in Italy, that your students will find, like, that your students weren't thinking of, right? You know your students well, you know what they're thinking, right, when they think of Italian food. So what you can show them to create that dissonance. And then I have 3 sample reflection questions here, right, about their first reaction. And then the second question is, again, a question that puts them in the situation that they want to refuse a food, right? And some of this, sometimes I think it really depends on the group. I hate to go off on a tangent, I apologize. But, for some students, you might choose, I'm sorry, let me go back. You might choose something that they will really, la lingua bovina qua, that's something that will really astound them, right? For some groups of students, you might think of something, I mean, dare I say shocking, right, to high school or early university students. For other students, it may not be that way. You may show them the variety or the number of ethnic restaurants in Milan, you know, or you may you may choose different images depending upon your group. But oh, I know the other one, because we had recently done this one too. You know, just what would you do, for example? And again, this can also seem very elementary, but it's not once you get students talking. What would you do, and how would you handle a situation when a salty or savory breakfast isn't available to you in the morning? Right? When you're not going to when you don't have an egg to eat. Now, you don't ask that question out of nowhere, right? You want to embed it in a conversation about norms, right? And practices. And you want students thinking about how their first reactions are not necessarily the way they're going to want to behave in a situation. And they're going to want to be able to demonstrate respect and adaptation. Right. And so in this second question of the reflection, we're asking students to picture themselves adapting and being respectful of others. And in the third question, again, we're sending it back to self-awareness and agency, and which foods from their culinary heritage a person from another one may find challenging to try. So allowing them that self-expression and that self-space. To close with these few minutes, I'm just going to go back to this perspectives 1 second. And since I am here, I'm going to have to go back to the chat. Actually, I think I'm going to have to make this, I'm going to have to stop sharing for a second. I apologize, so that I can see everything that I need to see at the same time. And give you some answers. All right. We enjoy doing these talks together because then we get to help each other out, and it all seems to always go smoothly. But in any case, so this perspectives activity is an activity that we consider a partner activity with a native speaker. We use Talk Abroad. We have inclusive access for textbooks at Ohio State. And so we are able to ask our students to spend extra money on Talk Abroad conversations. I will say that there are a number of new native speaker contribution videos in the 5th edition of Avanti, and we are also using those in our classrooms as a way to more frequently have our students exposed to the perspectives of people living in Italy. But so this is an example from when we did this activity with our students of what the Italians that they interviewed on Talk Abroad had to say when they had to describe the picture. And then I'll just go back to the chat and read a little bit of what we had to say. So we got some answers. So our answers is, and we can't really use in this situation, in a lot of our classes at Ohio State, we have used different ways, but we'll say like, we'll have to be specific because we are a lot of Italians also in this talk today. But I have an IBM conference room, a weekly meeting. I have somebody who suggests that they're sitting at Starbucks reviewing for a test, that they're hanging out and just chatting, an informal job meeting. Someone who says they are talking about food. We have someone who says an overextended faculty meeting. We know, I think lots of us know that feeling. We have someone else who says they're discussing how to market a new kind of panino. The person on the left is showing up the product, and they are all sharing their ideas. So marketing un panino. Someone else suggests that it's a break or a small department discussing a project, people waiting for a guest. And then we have a meeting of countless meetings. Sounds like that overextended faculty meeting. They're uninterested and distracted at and the lead at the head of the table is pensive. And then we have another, I like this one a lot too. These folks are waiting awkwardly for food to be served at a dinner party, but the host didn't start cooking until they arrived. So now they're super bored and they want to leave, but they don't want to be rude. I'm going to go back and we'll just take a look at this image again. And let's see, I'm going to move us out of the way so I can see. And here we go. When we do this activity with our students, we've done this again in K through 12 outreach, and we've done it in university classrooms, and we get a wide variety of answers. The debriefing that goes along with this type of perspectives activity, again, you can choose a lot of different photos that may be useful for your group of students. A lot of different images that can be interpreted lots of different ways. But our debriefings go like this, right? We ask our students to share what their talk abroad partner has described, right? And why there is a variety of interpretations, right? Everyone came up with different ideas. Why is there a variety of interpretations? And students generally understand that different perspectives come from different backgrounds. And we think of ways, we want to think of why, right? Why, what is it in our individual circumstances, right? We want to think of how some of us come to ideas, some ideas different than others, right? We don't want to just remain at the surface of what, right? But we have to realize that when we're thinking, well, why did someone think this, right? It is an interpretation, right? It's not fact necessarily, it's an interpretation. And once we get here, this is probably a mix of English and Italian that our students are using. But we really want to drive home at the end with a simple question is, are any of these answers better or worse than others? Well, of course not, right? Students can make it that far. They know, no, of course not. These answers are not better than others. What is the origin of the diversity of perspectives? We're having students talk about this in English, right? That different ideas and elements occupy a larger part of some of our lives than others, and they depend on our experiences and our backgrounds, as well as contemporary influences. And we always finish our end-of-class discussions of perspective activities with how does this relate to intercultural competence? I will show you briefly, and then you'll be able to see in this PowerPoint and in the recording the personal reflection questions that come along with this activity, this perspectives activity. They're about decentering, but I'm going to go back and drive home my last message, which is when we do these larger activities, this is our type 3 perspective activity. Generally speaking, we do these when students have access to a native speaker or a person living in Italy, their interpretation or their perspective on a situation or on an image. It's an activity that is a little bit longer, and it involves getting different views from multiple different people, as opposed to our image activities, which is just what our students think, right? In those image activities, they are describing what they think, and then they're seeing things that might jar them. And then we're still talking about interpretation and analysis, but it's somewhat contained, right? The interpretation and analysis is contained in our classrooms with our group of students. In our perspective activities, we really like them to talk to people outside, right? Have access to other ideas outside of the classroom. And what's important about perspective activities is that students can come away with the idea, right? That they can start processing the idea and really understanding, incarnating that there's equal validity in diverse perspectives. And that's something that's really easy to walk the walk. I mean, to talk the talk, but super hard to walk the walk. And when you start asking students reflection questions, and when you start asking students, what does this have to do with intercultural competence? Their answers can reveal to you how much they are able to really accept the validity, the equal validity of diverse perspectives. And then you can keep doing these activities. Right? You can keep having them look at different perspectives and different interpretations until hopefully sometime, right, they are able to demonstrate in their understanding of intercultural competence and in their personal reflections that they are giving equal space and equal validity to diverse perspectives. It takes a really long time, and it may not even happen in our classrooms, but this is how we put them on a good road, right? This is how we put them on a good road.